Good evening, Mr. O'Neill. Welcome to Athens.
It's very nice to be here.
Is inflation too hard to die yet? Or are we entering the beginning of the end of interest rate hikes? And in this sense, have we avoided the risk of recession in the Western economies? 3 questions in one.
I don't know. My honest answer is I don't know. It's tricky. I think one has to reflect on the whole thing, is, like many other things that have happened the past few years, is a bit of a surprise. And I don't think we really truly understand how much of the inflation impulse is because of, let's call it bad policy making, or lazy policy making, because, back at the start of COVID, virtually every major central banker was still worried about deflation.
That's true.
And I say that because it had become clear to me by then that QE had long passed its end of being useful. And of course, because of COVID...
So Germans were right.
I joked, I had lunch with Otmar Issing last summer, who I've got a huge amount of respect for. And I said to him, I said, you were probably right all along. And that maybe central banks having 2 pillars, including money supply, may have been, as you argued, at the Bundesbank forever, and when you went to the ECB, maybe it was right. But we don't know. And of course, what is interesting today is that money supply in many places is actually slowed dramatically. So the central banks, who had this thing for ages about how it was transitory, now are really worried it's going to be forever, unless they're really tough, might be going, in some scenarios I can consider, going too far. And I think it's because the interplay with that, and the Ukraine shock, the COVID shock, the interplay of China with the world is not going at all how people thought. Very interesting point in this regard. Chinese inflation is non-existent. China, the intellectuals started to argue 3 years ago that instead of China exporting deflation, it was going to export inflation. Not happened at all. And
because of the hard lockdowns?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure what it is. But there's certainly no domestic inflation in China, or for that matter, in a lot of Asia. So when I start thinking about that, and that money supply is slowing again, maybe actually the inflation is transitory. And here's the last part I'd say. If you look at long-term measures of inflation expectations, they're still pretty low.
All right.
So I'm slightly optimistic on this very complicated.
That's a good thing. Do you think the banks are well protected this time? Or have we yet, you're laughing, or have we yet to see the full impact of the high interest rate environment? I'm referring to both the US and the Eurozone.
I laugh, having been in the financial system professionally for nearly 35 years, and for 10 years since. One wonders whether the system can ever fully change. One of the few things I think I learned is that financial markets and investing are about greed and fear. And we're usually somewhere between the 2 extremes. And I think it's quite difficult for the banking system to not get overly carried away with cycles, because it's human nature. And when you reflect on what probably drove that question, the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, I mean, in hindsight, it was ridiculous. But because there's been a big craze about startups, this is the kind of thing what happens, especially when you've got these crazy low levels of interest rates. There are 1 or 2 warning signs. such as commercial real estate, not in Greece, but elsewhere, certainly in the UK, certainly in the US. So I wouldn't want to dismiss that we could have some huge banking problems that come out from rising rates. One of the other things I learned in over 35 years is that every time interest rates rise sharply, the financial system finds out that we're not all as smart as we think we are. And so why is this one going to be any different? Now, against that, the last thing on this is it does seem, because of 2008, that the concentration of risk is not as strong as it was then, and it's a bit more diversified. And certainly where we've seen real estate prices decline in the past 2 years in a number of countries, in the past you would have seen signs of real financial problems from that, and so far that's not happened.
In the meantime, geopolitics continues to make its presence felt, with ramifications in the economic landscape. Some people wonder whether and to what extent the dollar's primacy as the world's reserve currency is under threat. At the end of the day, how far do BRICs capabilities go?
You know, I laugh when I hear this question too. I mean, for 40 years, every other 5 years, people talk about the end of the dollar. I go far back enough that people used to say that with the Japanese yen, then of course with the euro, and now I think we had President Lula actually say recently there's going to be a BRICs currency, which is sort of ridiculous. Who would be the BRICS central bank governor?
So it's only a good way of marketing from the side of BRICs?
I think it's... I spend a lot of time, obviously, on the whole BRICS thing still, because it was stamped on my forehead forever. They love the symbolism of it, and the fact that there's nobody from the US involved is kind of why. But I sometimes humorously try to say to people, it's a good job for the dollar in the West that India and China never agree about anything. Because if they did, and the BRICS thing was really, really serious, then we would be closer to the end of the dollar's dominance. Mm-hmm. And one day, if India and China keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the dollar will cease to be the dominant currency that it is today. But I don't see any signs of it next year.
Do you see any scenario on the horizon for a modus vivendi in US-China relations? And if not, can globalization work that way in an international environment of introversion?
Yeah, this is, to me, one of the most depressing things of the past decade. People forget that since the turn of the century and the turn of the millennium, we have had hundreds of millions of people taken out of poverty. And global GDP growth in the last 2 decades was stronger than the 2 decades before. Why do we want to lose all of that? And we are in danger of it because of really 3 or 4 simple, ignorant reasons. Number one is the American intellectual leadership, frankly, seems scared about not being the biggest country in the world, which is ridiculous. You know, why shouldn't a country with 4 times more people not at least be as big as the US? The US should be focused on... Second thing linked to it is policymakers should focus on the wealth of their country as opposed to its size, because as China's got bigger, American wealth has got bigger. And so trying to stop China becoming bigger than the US, which is what this is often about, is not going to help the United States, in my view. And then, of course, the third thing is there's this sort of really naive view that it was all okay because China was going to become a democracy like us, which was so naive. I've never thought China had any aspirations to be like the US. In fact, when you look at the US today, who would want to be like the US? And then the fourth thing is China itself, however, has become more authoritarian. And I'm not sure China has dealt with its evolution and its role in global affairs very well. And so China's got to change for its own good as well. But I'm optimistically thinking we will get leaders or leaders' advisors, and maybe as we're having this discussion, it's starting with Antony Blinken currently in Beijing. Maybe this is the beginning of a more constructive reset.
Mm-hmm. And as far as I understand, the US worries about security.
You know, they always say it's about security. But
You don't believe them?
I don't fully believe them. I was quite involved in issues to do with China in my brief time as a minister, when the Huawei decision was made in the UK. And the reason why that happened is because the Americans pressurized us. It wasn't because we had genuine security concerns. And so that makes me suspicious that the Americans just have this thing about trying to stop anybody becoming as big as them.
In passing, it has been more than 3 years since Brexit. What impact has it had on the UK economy to date? Was it a good idea for Britain after all, in strictly economic terms?
No. I think the evidence 3 years since we actually left, and over 6 years since the vote, is that it's been a disaster. Disaster. Whether you look at trade, investments, UK growth, and ironically and sadly, inward net migration. We just had some statistics published in the past 2 months that show the highest annual increase in net migration. And instead of getting so many people from the EU, we're now getting more and more from the rest of the world. And so we haven't achieved what was the most important reason that seemed to influence the vote. And what really depresses me is, whilst I'd call myself a modest, objective Remainer, I didn't think it was the most important thing facing our future, because dealing with domestic inequalities regionally and doing something about our investment performance is what the country really needed. And I thought naively the shock of leaving would force the country to do something about that, but it hasn't. So it's been an unmitigated disaster.
But is it something that people in Britain are realizing?
Yes. If you look at the opinion polls and the commentary of the shrewd small number that thought we might leave, what is really interesting is virtually everything they say is if you had another vote now, we would not leave.
I can't help but ask you about Greece as well.
Yes.
What is the feeling about the Greek economy? The investment grade is its next goal after the elections. Is Greece's growth potential convincing enough?
I mean, my honest answer is I haven't been studying the Greek economy that closely, so I'm probably not the best person qualified. However, never stopped me talking about most things. You know, it is very interesting to be back here in Athens for the first time in over 5 years. And last time I came to speak at an event, the mood was very different, very pessimistic, and one of, can Greece ever grow again? And so what I would say is, yet again, Greece is an important lesson in that however bad a crisis feels, you can get over it. Second thing to say in the same spirit is never let a crisis go to waste. And in that regard, it does look like Greece is getting some improvements in its domestic investment spending than it did before the crisis. And so it's not just a lot of Greek borrowing to fund excessive consumption. And so that seems to me to be reasonably encouraging. I think one would hope that it was broader than what appears to be greatly dominated by the tourism sector. And as time goes by, and if the evidence shows that it spreads, I think it's clearly a matter of time before the investment grade comes back.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for asking me these questions.